Welcome to the deep dive. Imagine trying to peer into a crystal ball right at the start of the 20th century, trying to guess what the next 100 years might hold.
That's pretty much what we're doing today, isn't it? We're looking at this really fascinating book from 1902, H.G. Wells's Anticipations of the Reaction of Mechanical and Scientific Progress Upon Human Life and Thought.
I love that title.
It is, yeah.
Um,
But the idea is simple, really, though hugely ambitious. Wells wanted to sketch out a rough sketch of the coming time, kind of a prospectus for humanity.
It was all based on how technology, especially new things like the motor engine, would just change everything.
Exactly. How science and mechanics would reshape, well, basically all of human life and thought.
And he really went for it. I mean, transport, cities, new social classes,
The future of democracy.
what war would look like, even language, marriage, morality,
Yeah.
the whole lot.
So our plan for this deep dive is to unpack Wells's vision. What did he get right? What did he miss? And maybe the most interesting bit, what can his perspective from way back then tell you today? Living in the future he was trying to picture. So let's get into it.
Okay, so Wells starts with locomotion, how people and things move around. He saw that as the absolute key driver, right?
Yeah, he points out that the big symbol of the 19th century was the steam engine, the railway, materially speaking anyway.
And his argument is that changes in transport aren't just about getting places faster.
Not at all. They ripple out, they change cities, where people live, politics, even how wars are fought. But he also notes that the actual development of the tech, the inventing, the experimenting, that kind of follows its own path, driven by ideas and economics, almost separate initially.
So looking ahead from 1902, what's the big, the obvious next step he sees coming?
The motor vehicle, yeah, the motor car, motor bicycle, motor omnibus. He could see them arriving and just knew their potential was huge.
But he saw problems too, didn't he? Like motor buses getting stuck in traffic.
Right, stuck behind horse-drawn carts. He figured they'd struggle against suburban trains at first because of that.
And his solution for that is pretty wild.
It really is. He imagined the bus companies needing their own roads, like private roads.
Made of what? Something new.
Yeah, wider, maybe asphalt or something else entirely, built just for motors with separate lanes for each direction. And he kind of cheekily adds that these motors would probably just ignore fussy rules anyway.
Sounds familiar. He also compares motor travel to trains at the time. Trains weren't exactly luxury transport back then.
No, he mentions the discomfort, the shaking, how you'd need new inventions just to write a letter or eat properly on a long journey.
Although, didn't someone challenge him on that?
Oh, right. Yes. A correspondent, Mr. Rudolph Syrian, he wrote in saying, hang on, faster, smoother trains do exist in America because their carriages are bigger, more stable. You can write or dine okay there.
So Wells was part of a live debate, really.
Exactly. But even with motors coming, he didn't think the railways were finished.
No, he saw them adapting.
Yeah, becoming more specialized. Still vital for heavy stuff. Coal, timber, And for cheap day trips, they wouldn't vanish, just coexist with these new motor highways.
So trains adapt, and this whole shift in movement obviously changes the city itself.
Hugely. Wells says the old city was basically walkable or maybe horse commutable. A radius of, 4 miles on foot, maybe 8 by horse.
And railways blew that wide open,
Mhm.
leading to the sprawl, the suburbs splashing outwards, as he put it.
And he predicts the motor car will push that even further. A really strong centrifugal force, pulling people out from the dense center, easing congestion there.
What's pulling them out? Meant as a few things.
Well, things like a passion for nature, golfing, fishing, cycling were getting popular. Then there's the charm of cultivation, basically gardening.
And that desire for your own little house and garden.
Yeah, he called it a craving, especially strong, he thought, in English-speaking or Low German peoples.
But the city center still has its pull, doesn't it? Offices, shops.
Definitely. The core of business and entertainment. Plus, just the existing buildings, the highland values, the narrow streets like in London. He paints this picture of how hard and expensive it would be to widen them, like paving the streets with gold.
And that poor young lady getting splashed by a cab at Marble Arch.
Yeah.
So if widening streets is too hard, how do you fix the congestion?
This is where he gets really futuristic. Traffic regulation, separating types of traffic, sure, but his big idea, the moving platform.
Right, like a giant conveyor belt for people, that thing from the Paris exhibition.
Exactly. Continuous movement. You just step on or off. He thought it could be at street level, underground in tunnels, or even elevated.
And didn't someone suggest stacking them for speed?
Yeah, Professor Perry. The idea was layers of platforms rotating at different speeds so you could step from a slow one to a faster one. Wells saw this transforming the city center into essentially a bazaar.
A pedestrian zone, basically.
Pretty much shops, meeting places, maybe covered over, weatherproofed with these moving platforms. Lifts. Spacious, bright, lots of entertainment.
It sounds quite modern in some ways. He also thought some businesses might move out, like publishing.
Yeah, he figured they wouldn't need to be right in the expensive center anymore. Business was changing. Better postal services meant you could send proofs and books easily. You didn't need to bump into society figures quite so much.
Though some things would still keep people near the center, or at least bigger hubs.
Oh, for sure. Good schools, good doctors. Though maybe they'd cluster in those secondary centers, he imagined. And just, the love of the crowd, the theaters, the buzz, especially for people who couldn't afford a second home out in the sticks.
So the picture is these huge urban regions. People spread out, secondary hubs pop up, but the old center becomes this high-tech pedestrian space. It's a mix of spreading out and redesigning the core.
And all this physical change, naturally, shakes up society itself. Wells sees the old class system kind of dissolving.
He talks about the traditional landowners, the gentry, being sort of swallowed up by this new group of wealthy people.
Yeah, the vast, irregular development of irresponsible, wealthy people, he calls them. And out of this chaos, he spots two new groups emerging that don't really fit the old patterns.
Shareholders.
Right, the shareholding class. And then the very poor, the slum dwellers, prisoners, asylum inmates, who he later calls the real people of the abyss.
Let's focus on those shareholders for a second. How does he describe them?
As, well, irresponsible, independent, rich, but feeling no pressure of exertion. Their money, he says, has no relation whatever to his activities. They just cash checks, basically.
And he thought this group would grow, become more dominant.
Yes, increase and preponderate was his word. But crucially, he didn't see them as a cohesive ruling class. They're too diverse, no shared experience or goals to unite them for action. He calls them an eddy in the flow of progress. They'll stick around as long as things are changing and new companies are popping up, creating more shares.
So if they're just an eddy who is driving things forward.
Well, in contrast to them, he sees this new powerful group rising, that great and expanding body of mechanics and engineers.
And that includes everyone from the top bosses down to the repair guy.
Exactly. He uses bicycle repair as an example, the whole spectrum of technical skill.
And what makes them different for Wells?
They're educated and adaptable in a way the old craftsmen weren't. Their skill comes from understanding principles, not just following tradition.
Which puts them in conflict with older ways, like traditional trade unions.
Yes. He saw the old unions as based on this conflict between boss and worker, drudgery versus intelligence. He also knocks conservative craftsmen. His example is plumbers resisting modern sanitation, saying this new adaptable class would sweep that aside.
And this adaptable class would even change farming.
He thought so. Their influence would bring better schools and machinery to the countryside, changing agriculture from isolated farms to more varied, specialized cultivation.
Okay, so from these big social shifts, Wells zooms right in on the home, marriage, morality, especially for this new technical, scientific middle class.
Yeah, he gets incredibly specific about their homes, designed to be sanely constructed to cut down on pointless chores.
The details are amazing, aren't they?
Yep.
No basements without lifts, rounded corners so dust doesn't collect.
Wall heating from a power station, no coal, no ash, no dirt, no chimneys except maybe for the kitchen. Shoes you could just wipe clean.
Automated window washing. Seriously.
Yeah. Water or solvent running down the glass. Electric cookers with temperature control cooking could even become a pleasant amusement, he thought. Cleaner roofs, too. No smoky chimneys.
And fewer servants in these smaller, efficient homes.
He predicted that. Partly fewer people available or willing to do service, maybe partly a growing sense that the whole master-servant thing wasn't quite right. He sees the wife managing the home, but like a technically capable individual, using technology efficiently.
Leading to more unique houses, maybe? Personal homes?
Possibly, yeah. More freedom to choose where to build, away from the city constraints, could lead to more local styles, more aesthetic thought.
Then he shifts to marriage and morality. He questions the old reasons for monogamy, right?
Right. He saw it rooted in stability for kids, and the wife being a vital helper to the working man in the pre-mechanical era.
But he wonders what happens when you have childless couples, or women who don't work but just spend the husband's money. Does the institution still make sense in the same way?
Exactly. Will that agreeable, unemployed, childless woman have the same status as the traditional wife and mother? He predicts pressure for easier divorce, more relaxed marriage laws.
Driven partly by people moving around more.
Yeah, increased travel and migration would mean people with very different moral codes bumping up against each other, making strict uniform laws harder to maintain.
Which leads him to predict this idea of moral segregation. What's that?
It's the idea that people will naturally sort themselves into groups based on shared values, lifestyles, how they run their households, their menages, he calls them.
And these groups might develop their own little cultures.
Yeah, potentially quite distinct cultures, with their own books, manners, ways of doing things. He even suggests the decline of massive bestsellers, literary booms, might be an early sign of this fragmentation already starting.
So less one-size-fits-all morality.
That's the idea. A confusion of moral standards, he calls it. Public opinion and religious authority would have less power over these personal choices, a bit like how religion became more of a private matter after the Reformation.
Okay, so from the very personal, Wells zooms back out to politics.
Yeah.
And he's not a fan of the democracy of his time.
Not at all. He thinks calling the era democratic is misleading. He sees democracy as just a temporary phase, a first makeshift solution.
Why makeshift?
Because the old ruling classes were losing their grip, and these new forces tied to industry, the managers, the skilled workers, were gaining influence but hadn't yet figured out how to effectively wield power.
He calls the democratic era gray. What does he mean by that?
Gray, yes. Disorderly, confusing, but mistakenly seen as just boringly uniform. He felt governments treated everyone like identical blocks, ignoring real differences and needs.
But he thinks the gray will fade. What comes next?
That technically skilled middle class we talked about, the scientifically trained middle class of an unprecedented sort, he believes they'll rise up and effectively become the state, consciously.
He's really harsh on the politicians of 1902.
Oh, incredibly. He calls them amateurs, public school types who just don't get that specialist knowledge or hard facts matter. They ignore the experts, the engineers, the scientists, and just focus on how things look, appearances, not real efficiency.
And the whole political system, the politicians and the public.
He sees it as this useless seesaw. On one side, the boss politician obsessed with getting elected, no long-term vision, no real analysis. On the other, public opinion, this shapeless mass easily swayed by newspapers. Neither side, he thinks, can actually plan or achieve anything substantial. Newspapers just reflect noise, they don't lead.
And the result of these gray governments?
Inevitable failure. They lack foresight, structure. They're doomed to foster enmity between people and people, which leads him straight into talking about
war, which he obviously thought about a lot.
Definitely. And he argues these same inefficient gray governments that stir up conflict are also terrible at actually fighting wars. They care more about looking good in peacetime than having ammo, proper training, or adapting to new tech.
What do we think future land war would look like back in 1902?
Skilled snipers in trenches and tunnels, basically. Supported by long-range guns, slow, careful advances, maybe using night or smoke for cover.
And he even predicted air combat.
Yeah, purely speculative then, but quite vivid. Balloons for spotting enemy positions, directing artillery, but also these fighting airships he called air sharks, maybe with rams, battling balloons or each other. A real spectacle.
And what would decide victory in this new kind of war?
Not just brute force. He stresses things like imaginative foresight, constant adaptation, perpetual alteration of tactics, perpetual production of unanticipated devices, and above all, intelligence and skill in lots of individuals. Brains over sheer numbers.
He also saw war forcing a kind of temporary socialism behind the lines.
Yes, a practical realization of socialistic conceptions. He figured the massive effort needed for modern war would force the government to take over essential services and skilled people. All the efficiency managers, doctors, engineers, factory owners, suppliers would essentially become public servants, organized centrally. Wartime nationalization out of necessity.
And how would a defeated nation actually be controlled?
Not just by occupation. He thought the key was seizing the vital apparatus, the water supply, power stations, food distribution, control those, and you create unbearable pressure, area by area.
What about war at sea?
Speed, range, hitting power, accuracy. He imagined fast, agile ironclads, alert and deadly as a striking snake, he says, with big guns and rams. Interestingly, he was skeptical about submarines being the game changer.
And naval victory.
Quick, decisive battles, won by the side with the better gear and, again, the right kind of sailors. Capable, headlong men with brains and no ascertainable social position. Control the sea, control the coasts, and trade.
One striking thing is how one-sided he thought future wars would become.
Very much so. A foregone conclusion, he said. Fought by the side that knows it's going to win because it's better prepared, better organized, has better tech and people. War would have this quality of sudden, pitiless revelation.
And the old armies, the masses of infantry.
He had utter contempt for them. Half-trained lads in uniform led by clueless amateurs, totally ineffective against a modern, sanely organized army. He predicted terrible, wasteful slaughter, needless and most pitiful killing of these unprepared soldiers. A really chilling forecast of what was coming.
Okay, so with the world getting smaller through transporting communication, Wells naturally turns to languages and national identities clashing.
Yeah, and he pulls no punches. He dismisses the whole idea of fixed European races, Teutonic, Celtic as phantoms, nonsense. He says they're all mixed up historically, you can't really define them purely.
He looks back at how things like roads and writing allowed bigger kingdoms and empires to form.
Right, but he makes the point that they achieved political unity, maybe, but not cultural or linguistic unification. The different languages and cultures mostly stayed separate, and things were often unstable.
But now, with modern tech, he thinks that blending is unavoidable.
Irresistible, yeah. Which leads to a struggle for existence between languages. Smaller languages are at a disadvantage, he reckons. They can't compete with the big ones for books, science, education. He picks out English, French, and German as the main contenders in Europe.
But he doesn't automatically assume English wins, which is interesting looking back.
It is. He notes how slowly it spread in places like French Canada or South Africa, says it lacks contagious quality. And he actually saw English literature in a kind of intellectual decline at the time.
Why? What does he blame?
A poor publishing industry, no real critical public demanding quality, too much focus on making money or social climbing instead of real intellectual achievement. He even criticizes the British Crown for not valuing intellectual contributions enough.
What about French and German, then?
He saw them both as aggregating languages, pulling others in. He actually thought French might spread further than German, despite Germany publishing more books. Why? Because of France's intellectual vitality, the range and quality of thinking available in French.
He then looks at these political movements trying to group similar peoples together. Anglo-Saxonism, Pan-Germanism, Pan-Slavism.
He sees them as basically attempts to gang up against other groups.
Yeah.
And he warns that if they can't find a rational way to unite, they'll end up fighting.
How did he rate their chances?
Not highly, generally.
Yeah.
Latin Union, limited prospects outside France and maybe northern Italy. Pan-Slavism, too many language divisions, different literary traditions, plus Russia was stagnant under the Tsar, lacking that educated middle class he thought was crucial. He even predicts Russia might eventually get absorbed by China or East Asia.
Wow. And Pan-Germanism.
He thought it was hemmed in by hostile neighbors and might suffer if Germany got less capable rulers after Kaiser Wilhelm II.
He actually seemed surprisingly more positive about France's position.
Yeah, partly based on military theory at the time, work by a writer called Bloch suggested modern war favored defense and intelligence. Wells thought the French character was suited to that. He predicted France wouldn't fight alone, and Europe was heading for bigger conflicts anyway.
So his bottom line on nations and languages is stop resisting the inevitable consolidation.
Pretty much. Clinging to old small nations and nationalisms is just asking for disaster, forcible conformities, and war. He pictured them like people stubbornly sitting down firmly in the middle of the high road, blocking progress towards larger, more logical units.
Okay, so if the old governments are failing and nations are forced to blend or fight, who actually leads this process? Who brings the order?
This is where Wells introduces his big idea, the New Republic.
Which isn't a country or a party, right? It's something else.
Yeah, exactly. It's the force he believes will eventually run the world. An unprecedented sort of people, totally separate from existing governments.
How does it come about?
As a conscious organization of intelligent and quite possibly in some cases wealthy men, a movement really. It might ignore politics or just use the existing system when it suits them. It starts informally, people finding common ground.
And he saw the English-speaking world as a likely starting point, but with America taking the lead.
Yes, he predicted Britain would lose its top spot to the U.S. because of American efficiency, better education, stronger industry, especially iron, steel, electricity.
And wealthy individuals play a key role in building this.
He highlights people like Andrew Carnegie, funding colleges, libraries, investing in the education needed to create this new, capable class. He saw them building the future for the whole English-speaking world, not just one country.
Publishing is important too.
Absolutely vital. The New Republic would need better ways to spread knowledge, living literature, he called it. Efficient publishing trusts, better distribution, getting important ideas out there, not just relying on the random commercial market.
And he ties this into the rise of big business trusts.
He does. His view of trusts is interesting. He didn't just see them as monopolies trying to make money. He saw them as these powerful organizations taking over whole chunks of public life industry, communications operating outside government, but run by, in his view, more competent people. He saw them having national, even international goals.
So who are these new Republicans, in essence?
They're intelligently critical. They have the courage to follow their ideas through. They form this kind of informal and open Freemasonry. They're distinct from the passive shareholders on one side and the poor, the abyss, on the other.
Okay, last big area.
Really?
Wells dives deep into the potential religion, ethics, the core values of this new republic.
Yeah, he speculates their religion would be a kind of broad, confident theism. Seeing God revealed in the whole universe, not through crude, human-like images or stories. Their focus would be on figuring out God's purpose and trying to serve it through their own actions.
He argues that 19th century science, Darwin, geology, etc., had basically destroyed the foundations of old religious ideas, like the biblical fall of man.
Exactly. And because those old foundations were gone, there was a desperate need for a whole new ethical system, an ethical reconstruction.
And the core of this new ethics is pretty stark.
It is. Life to be a privilege and a responsibility, and the alternative to living fully, beautifully, and efficiently is basically to die out.
He says they deal simply and logically with birth as well as death.
Yes. And he makes this point about sex that its primary moral significance is only about having children, reproduction. Anything else, he suggests, is like a game may be enjoyable, but only really objectionable if it's unproductive or wastes time and energy needed for more important things.
Which leads to probably the most disturbing part of his vision, how this new republic deals with people considered inefficient.
Yeah, this is where it gets very harsh. He suggests they would deliberately shape society, public policy, to make life actively unpleasant and difficult for anyone who didn't meet a certain standard of social efficiency. No more coddling laws for adults, as he put it.
No safety nets, basically. No tolerance for perceived failures.
Pretty much. No tolerance for dark corners like slums or for populations seen as stagnant or unproductive. Efficiency becomes the main test for being part of this future society. And he argues this test should apply regardless of race, white, black, red, brown, Jew.
He specifically mentions Jewish people.
Yes, basically saying there should be no special treatment, but also arguing that if the system made social parasitism impossible, any such perceived tendency in any group would just vanish.
And the final brutal conclusion for those who don't measure up.
That they will have to go. They'll have to die out and disappear. His justification is that the purpose of the world, of the race, is bigger than any individual's happiness. It's a really quite chilling vision of a future focused solely on efficiency and a particular idea of progress.
So that's the sweep of it. H.G. Wells in 1902 laying out this incredibly detailed, sometimes startlingly accurate, sometimes deeply troubling picture of the century to come. Technology driving massive urban change, dissolving old classes, creating this new technical elite, the new republic.
Predicting the failure of old-style governments, the changing nature of war, the clashes of language, and these profound shifts in morality and even the meaning of life itself.
His main thrust seems to be that this new efficient class wouldn't need to win elections in the traditional sense. Their power would come from their knowledge, their organization, their control of the essential system.
Right. Their sheer competence would eventually make them dominant.
So Wells wrote this well over 100 years ago. Looking around today, how much of that rough sketch feels, well, strangely familiar? The sprawl, the power of tech companies, the constant drive for efficiency.
And what about his darker predictions? That focus on efficiency over individual welfare, the idea of social sorting, the purpose of the race. What does that make you think about our world right now?
Definitely something to chew on. Which bits of Wells's future seem to be playing out most clearly, and what might that mean for the path we're actually on compared to the one he anticipated? Lots to reflect on there.